Well, it's become fashionable in recent months and years to refer to the war in the Middle East between Israel and Iran, Israel and Hamas, the various terror proxies that Iran funds and supports, to refer to these wars as genocide. Now, most people living today are not old enough to have experienced one of the greatest genocides of all time, the Holocaust, perpetrated by the Nazis upon the Jewish people. But I think that our distance from this perhaps gravest example in human history of the eradication of an entire people group has led some to throw this term around willy-nilly. And I think this is especially problematic because when we apply the term to the wrong issue, we may lose sight of the true genocide. So words have meaning, words have power. We talk about that a lot on this show, about using the right words to describe things, speaking the truth, speaking it clearly and boldly. And so we're going to get into some facts and figures in this episode, but we're also going to get down to a very fundamental issue that is rooted in Scripture, and it is written on the human heart, despite modernity's protestations to the contrary. So, even very liberal estimates of the war in Gaza put the total number of deaths, and this is total, men, women, children, at 67 to 75,000 over the span of about 2.5 years since the October 7th massacre in 2023, where Hamas Palestinian militants entered Israel and slaughtered over 1,000 people. 67,000 to 75,000. And that sounds like a really big number, until you consider the fact that in 1 year alone, now this is according to the Guttmacher Institute, in 1 year alone, last year, 2025, in the United States alone, there were 1,126,000 abortions committed. And yet, even saying that, I feel a discomfort in the pit of my stomach using the word abortion. Because you see, this is a euphemism for a grave, terrible crime against humanity that cries out to God for justice. And we really ought to not be whitewashing it and using the preferred terms of the secular progressives who demonize Christians at every turn while undermining the sanctity of life and the importance of human freedom and dignity. 1,126,000 human babies mercilessly slaughtered in their mother's womb in 2025, compared to 75,000 people, mostly adults, mostly combatants, killed in Gaza in 2.5 years. In case you're not good at mental math, that is over 10 times in 1 year the number of people that have been killed in Gaza in 2.5 years. I say all this to set up what I intend to lay out in this episode as my case against the very real and much, much more serious genocide that we euphemistically call abortion. Welcome back, folks. Thank you for joining me here, as always, on Luke Up. And this is a very heavy topic. And it's not one that I undertake lightly or without a lot of prayer and deliberation. But there's a lot of grandstanding, I think, on this issue. You know, people that because they are politically aligned a certain way, you know, they'll use certain rhetoric and try to get a lot of attention for themselves. And I'm not a person of any sort of position of power on this issue. You know, the only power that I have is to approve or deny septic systems. You know, I have nothing to do with protecting human life. That job belongs to the lawmakers and the law enforcement officials to work in tandem as the third estate, the government, which God instituted for the punishment of evil. That job lies with them. But insofar as I am a voter in America, and I guess you could say to an extent an influencer in my very modest, very small viewership, but you know, I'm not necessarily in a position to take action directly. I can and do take action through supporting with my money organizations like Preborn that provide assistance to mothers who are overwhelmed by pregnancy and considering taking drastic actions. Again, I have no sponsors on this show. This is just me talking here. But if we're going to talk about this issue seriously, and if we're going to, you know, really try to convince anyone, I think the human cost needs to be explored, and the roots of this practice really need to be exposed. Because when you consider those numbers, it's staggering and it's sickening. But we didn't get here overnight. And the United States of America is far from unique on this matter. There has been a systemic problem with child sacrifice in many places and at many times in human history. And we get to read about many of them in our own Bible. And it's a mark of shame that is a blot on the history of even the people of Israel. So we're going to look at some of those examples. We're going to look at where some of these influences came from. And on a theological level, we're going to talk about the motivations, you know, why people allow themselves to be convinced that a human person gestating in his or her mother's womb is not in fact a person. You know, people don't usually decide things based purely on reason. Most people have motivations that stem from self-serving ends. What do I get out of this? How does it benefit me to believe that this is true? And that's how most people, even people that reach the right conclusions, that's how most people make their decisions. So we need to understand the underlying basis for this abhorrent, despicable, evil practice. And then we need to talk about the Christian approach to actually making things better. And you will not be surprised to learn that I think that this involves serious wielding of state power to achieve good ends in service of God's kingdom and in obedience to his commands. So let's go ahead and read our Bible verse of the day. We're about 10 minutes in, and it seems like I can't get to the Bible verse of the day in less than 10 minutes. So, we have the first intro, and then we have the second intro, and you know my methods, and you also know that at this point, before I read, I need to ingest some liquid. Liquid courage. It's not alcohol. It's just ginger ale. Not even like the good stuff. It's healthy ginger ale. It is good. All right. I think that this verse will be familiar to many of you. I generally assume that most of my viewership is Christian, or at least some sort of believer in a God and seeking after the truth. I don't really expect that I have too many militant atheists watching, although our friend Chris may be listening to this, and honestly I hope that he is, and I hope that he actually hears out some of my points. So let's go ahead and read the Bible verse of the day, and then we'll get into the points of the issue. All right, we're going to be looking at the Psalms once again. I find that, and I really, really enjoyed my most recent read-through of the Psalms. I don't know why, but until recently, I kind of stayed away from the Psalms. I think I had this misperception that they were kind of repetitive and, it's just boring old hymn type language, and God is great and God is good and God is majestic. And when you really dig into the Psalms, you find a lot of deep theological material there to digest. And it is just so uplifting and helps you get yourself oriented right with God. One of my favorite political commentators is fond of saying that religion is a habit of virtue that inclines the will to give to God what he deserves. Well, I find when I read the Psalms that it inclines my will toward God. So we're going to draw from the Psalms again in this week's Bible verse of the day. And specifically, we'll be in Psalm 139. And I know that this passage will be familiar to many of you, but I think it's very important. So Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. Psalm 139, 13 through 16. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Now, for someone who is a materialist and, again, has a motivation, a self-serving motivation, to say that life does not begin at conception, this may not do that much for you. You may just say, well, that's just some kooky old writing, and actually, life is a variable term that can be defined at various points depending on one's preference and one's delineation of brain function and viability. And you get into a lot of these egghead type scientific arguments about when life begins. And the problem is, none of it is verifiable. If you say that life begins at 16 weeks or whatever, you may have some type of marker that you have chosen to say, well, see, at 16 weeks, there is this level of brain function. And before 16 weeks, there's not. And that level of brain function is what constitutes life. And you can always ask the question, says who? What are you basing that on? You know, I've heard this analogy, and I think it's very fitting, that if you believe that the fetus gestating in a woman's womb is not a human life, and so you have decided due to various circumstances that it needs to be aborted so that you can go make more money for Amazon, punching numbers into spreadsheets or something. So you've decided that, it's very early on. I can't see it. It's just part of my body. So I'm going to go get an abortion. And I put that term in quotes because I really don't like it. I do not like that term at all. It is infanticide, and we need to start calling it as such. Okay, slight digression. Little soapbox for the moment. But I've heard this analogy that so you are getting an abortion, and you believe that it's not a human life. This is something like opening the door to a pitch black room and throwing a hand grenade inside. The best thing that could happen is nothing. That's your best case. But if you're wrong, then you could have just killed someone. So what you could do is just not throw a grenade into a dark room where you can't possibly know if there's a person inside. So I think that for those who don't believe life begins at conception, at best, you are throwing a grenade into a dark room. You don't actually know. You might believe that it's because of some artificially constrained characteristic, that it's brain function, or it's a heartbeat, or it is a certain size, or it's a certain level of musculoskeletal development. But you don't know. You're just guessing. And you are guessing with someone's life if you're wrong. So I don't think the motivation really matters. The motivation for killing one's own child, it's never good. I defy you, if you're listening to this and you hold the pro-abortion position, I defy you to name one circumstance, name one, in which the motivation for killing a child in the womb is not selfish. One. Because here's the thing. If, even in these cases, because the pro-abortion activists like to throw out these edge cases, right? Rape, incest, life of the mother. Okay, well, two of those are really easy. Okay, Charlie Kirk had a great way of addressing this. When he talked about children conceived in rape, he would say, look, I have 2 ultrasounds here. One of these was conceived in rape. Which one is it? The point being, you can't tell. The end result is still the same thing. God can use evil means to to create good ends. We talk about this all the time on this show. Romans 8:28 and Genesis 49, I can't remember what verse. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. So he's all the time working good out of our evil actions. So the rape one, easy. Incest, well, yes, you should definitely not be doing that, and it's sinful and gross and evil and terrible, and you are significantly increasing the likelihood that your child will have some sort of defect, some sort of malady. But once that child is conceived, the prevention is over. The child's there. So as a parent, you have a duty to raise your child no matter what sort of deformity he or she may have. And the whole life of the mother thing. First of all, this is a very, very rare thing where a woman's life is threatened because of her pregnancy. And so, first of all, at a fairly early stage in development, a C-section is possible. And it's like 20 or 25 weeks, something like that. So the baby can be surgically removed without having to be birthed. But even if that's not possible, within the vanishingly small number of cases where a woman's life is threatened by her pregnancy and the baby cannot be safely removed from the womb, you still don't get to kill someone because another person is in danger. This used to be very simple and just intuitively understood by all people. You know, when Bill Clinton said that he wanted abortions to be safe, legal, and rare, well, why would you want them to be rare? If it's just a clump of cells, what does it matter? Well, you want them to be rare because you recognize that it is killing a child. It's taking a human life. And so you believe that there would be a very rare number of cases where it was medically necessary to the mother. My contention as a Christian is all human life is sacred. And you don't get the right to kill a baby because his mother is sick. That baby deserves a chance at life. Because he didn't create himself. When a man and a woman engage in a procreative union, which is what sex is, it is not primarily for fun. It is not even primarily to bring two people closer together. That's a wonderful benefit that married couples have. But it is primarily a procreative act. That is what it is designed to do. And so when you do the thing that is designed to make children and you make a child, that child has been created through no action of his own. And we used to believe as Americans, and we still believe as Christians, and I mean actual Christians, not fake Christians, actual Christians, believe that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. The foremost among those is the right to life. Now, you can forfeit your right to life when you commit an egregious crime like first-degree murder, in which case the state is justified in taking your life in exchange. But before you do that, you are just born with a natural right to life. A right is something that somebody doesn't have to give you. You just have it by virtue of existing. And as parents, it is your obligation to protect the right of that child to live. So this is all very basic stuff. But again, where does this come from? Where did people ever get the idea that killing their children was okay or even something to be celebrated? Because we've now reached the point in our society when it's no longer safe, legal, and rare. It's shout your abortion. So how on earth did we get here? Why are we not still saying safe, legal, and rare, which I still disagree with? But why is that not what the progressives are saying? This is why. Because sin is progressive. Sin never stops. It is a cancer that metastasizes. And if it is not quarantined and destroyed, it will continue to rot away at everything that it touches. God gave us a means to quarantine it. Through the death of his Son, Jesus Christ, he obtained victory over sin for all of us. And without him, there is no hope for any good in this world, or ever. But sin is progressive. Let me tell you what I mean by that. All throughout the Old Testament, we see this infuriating pattern. If you read through, say, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you read the history of the people of Israel and how they would have a good king for a while, and the good king would tear down the places of false worship to idols and demons and the Canaanite gods, the pagan gods, and would institute moral laws and ensure that the books of the law were taught and that people had a place where they could come and hear God's commandments given to them. And things were good. They prospered. There was nothing to punish them for other than on a personal basis, which they had temple sacrifices as a means to atone for that. And so things were good. And then the good king would die and would have a son who would become enamored with worldly things and would build back the high places, the places of worship, to the false gods, and would... I mean, you see it even in the house of David. In Solomon, David's son, the wisest king of all time. He built a powerful kingdom. He acquired vast amounts of wealth through trade and through his empire. And yet, he took up hundreds of wives and concubines, and towards the end of his life began to dabble in their strange religions. And so, this is what happens. Christians, I'm talking to you. This is what happens when we start to look like the world. When we start to play with the world. Now, we have to live in the world, and I say all of this as someone who has hobbies, and I enjoy using the fruits of my labor, and there's not inherently anything wrong with that. But when we start to look like the world, we start to absorb worldly ideas. And I'm sorry, the slippery slope is not a fallacy. It is a naturally observable phenomenon. It is basically a natural law. the slippery slope. Because what happens with the people of Israel is they don't just start cutting down trees and fashioning them into shapes and decorating them with silver. Jeremiah talks about this in Jeremiah chapter 10. And people working really hard to build these idols that are dumb and immobile, and they just sit on your mantle, and that's what you're going to bow down and put all your trust in. This is the reason for the first and second commandment. Well, it starts with that. But when you start believing in the things of the world, eventually you're going to start adopting some of their ideas. And it'll happen slowly. And you may not even realize that it's happening. It starts out as a sort of softness toward people, which is a good thing. We should love people, even those who don't believe in Jesus, because we need to be a light to the world. We need to be salt and light. And so it starts out from a good place. You want to care for people. You don't want to offend them. But when we are hesitant to tell the truth because we don't want to be off-putting to someone, that's where we run into problems. Because over time, as you become sort of anesthetized to being political, we'll say, being diplomatic and not telling the whole truth, you kind of start to almost believe that, well, maybe it's not actually that bad. Maybe there's a legitimate reason for this thing that I think is sinful, but somebody else doesn't. And so maybe it's fine if they have their own views. But then you go a step further. And if you tolerate it, if you think, well, it's fine for them, you may start to think, well, really, if it's fine for them, why isn't it fine for me? And so it's sort of like the frog in boiling water analogy. You know, you don't notice the changes right away if they happen all at once. But when your society continually incorporates more and more worldly things, and you don't seek first the kingdom of God, you just get so far afield that you can convince yourself that you're still a Christian and you are as far from Christ as it is possible to be. So here's some examples of how the people of Israel turned their backs on the one true God and how it manifested in some really dark places with respect to children. So there are descriptions in the books of both Isaiah and Jeremiah, and maybe this would be a good time to read a little bit from Isaiah. I think we will. Isaiah 57. We'll say, starting in verse 3. I think this is really important. And this chapter has a heading that says Israel's futile idolatry. So Isaiah 57, verse 3. But come here, you sons of the sorceress, you offspring of the adulterer and the harlot. Whom do you ridicule? Against whom do you make a wide mouth and stick out the tongue? Are you not children of transgression, offspring of falsehood, inflaming yourselves with gods under every green tree, slaying the children in the valleys under the cleft of the rocks? Among the smooth stones of the stream is your portion. They are your lot. Even to them you have poured a drink offering. You have offered a grain offering. Should I receive comfort in these? So Isaiah is decrying the practice when he says in verse 5, slaying the children in the valleys. He's referring to a place called Topheth in the valley of Hinnom. And from what I understand about this place, this was a region where the children of Israel had learned a practice from the Canaanites whereby they would have this metal idol that, it looked somewhat humanoid. It would have a torso and a head, and it would have hands that were held out. And what they would do is they would heat up this metal, like in a forge, and just get it burning hot. And they would take their own children and lay them in the hands of the burning idol until their children were burned alive. We're talking about babies, infants. And they believed that doing this would obtain them some favor, some sort of blessing from these gods. The primary one was Moloch. That's a name that's mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. King Ahaz famously burned his sons in the valley of Hinnom by this method. Later, King Josiah, who instituted a lot of reforms, he was a good king, really good king, destroyed Topheth, the primary place that this practice was indulged in. But this was a practice that came from the Phoenicians, I believe, who were from the city of Carthage, or the city-state of Carthage. Interestingly enough, I believe that is where St. Augustine hailed from in several centuries later in the 5th century AD. Now, I hope that you have the same reaction that I did when I first read that in detail about how this practice was carried out, which is revulsion and horror and disgust and anger. If you have any sort of decency and you have children and you love your children, and you know that you don't want any harm to come to them. So imagine your child at the age that he or she is now. Imagine taking that child and slaughtering them in such a ghastly, gross, disturbing way. I'm sure it's unimaginable to you. So how did we get here? How did we get from the people of Israel standing on the mountaintop in Exodus chapter 21, I think, or maybe 24? It's kind of all there together right after the Ten Commandments are given in Exodus 20. The people standing all together in unison, swearing to obey the commandments of the Lord their God. How did we get from there to burning their children alive in the molten hands of a metal god? I didn't mention this a moment ago, but the primary little g god that they would sacrifice their children to was called Moloch. But the other god that was frequently referred to is Baal. I know some people call him Baal. I don't think that's right. I think it's supposed to be pronounced Baal, Baal. You'll also see in certain writings from history, this is not just in the Bible that this name appears. This is a real cultural phenomenon. And elsewhere in other cultures, the name Baal is written out as Bel or Bel. Same thing. He was supposedly a god of fertility And so, you take your child to go sacrifice him in the molten hands of a man-made idol, and in return you are blessed by the nature gods. It's essentially the earliest version of nature worship. You sacrifice your children to the gods of nature. Well, as Solomon tells us, there is nothing new under the sun. Look what's happening now. You have people that are committing abortion, murder of their unborn children, in service to the climate, in service to the planet which God gave to us, yes, to steward, but also to fill and multiply upon and subdue. People sacrificing their children in the name of the planet. It is Gaia worship. It is nature worship. There is this thread running through all of human history whereby turning one's back on the one true God always and forever leads to evil, suffering, torment, and the most vile, wretched sins that you could possibly imagine. I know it's become popular to talk about Adolf Hitler as though he were some sort of Christian. Now, he co-opted the churches and basically made them into mouthpieces for his movement. But Adolf Hitler hated Christians. He hated Christianity, just like he hated Judaism, because he read Friedrich Nietzsche, and he learned all about the idea of the Übermensch, and so he thought that Christianity was a religion for weak people. So Adolf Hitler was not a Christian. He was drawn to the occult and dark powers. And this is always the choice. This is what I'm getting at. And then we'll talk about some modern day things that I think will be applicable. This is always the choice that we're faced with as Christians, as humans. When Jesus said that a man cannot serve two masters, for he will either love the one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, which is wealth. And what he means more broadly is you cannot serve God and the world. You will have a master, but will your master be God, or will it be the antithesis of God? Will it be Christ, or will it be Antichrist? And by Antichrist, I mean those three sources of temptation to sin that have plagued all of us since the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden. The flesh, the world, and the devil. Will you serve God, or will you serve the flesh, the world, and the devil? That's the thing about the infanticide folks. They generally get into the nature worship. They certainly worship themselves. They put themselves up on a pedestal, and they glorify themselves. They look to their appearance and status and success as the ultimate source of their comfort, rather than to their creator and sustainer. So it is the worship of nature, it is the worship of the self, and ultimately it's the worship of the devil. And there's truly no in-between. If you do not serve God, you serve the devil. Case in point, a couple years ago, at some music awards show. I don't really keep up with that stuff because it's stupid. I don't care about it. But some award show, what is it, the Emmys or the Grammys or whatever, someone gave a performance. I think it was the guy Sam Smith, gay British guy. And his performance, he was performing this song called Unholy, which tells you everything right there. Nomen est omen. The name tells you everything that you need to know. But in it, there were red, stereotypical cartoonish looking devil type figures. Red painted bodies and horns and the whole get up. And I distinctly remember seeing a clip of that where he's singing with all the red devil people dancing around him, and it pans out away from the crowd and it says, "The Grammys brought to you by Pfizer." And it was just so perfect. It was like the ultimate worldly authority at the time, because this is during COVID, the ultimate earthly authority declaring its allegiance to Satan. Now, I'd love to take a little detour and talk about, imagery of the devil and kind of where this cartoonish image comes from and how that lessens our actual fear of the very real person of the devil, who does not appear as a horned red beast, but appears as things that are desirable. And he whispers into our ear just the way that the serpent whispered into Eve's ear in the garden and told her that fruit would be good to eat. We'll probably do an episode on that at some point on, temptation, or maybe even just an episode on the devil. I think that would be very good. But I really want to focus on the issue of child sacrifice. We've talked a little bit about the gods that people sacrifice their children to. But I want to talk about the Christian approach to this problem in the modern day. Sorry, got to alternate the water and the ginger ale. Ginger ale to wet my whistle, and the water to keep me somewhat hydrated. Okay, so I saw a clip recently of the relatively new Congressman Brandon Gill. I believe he's from Texas. And he was on the stand. He was grilling some abortion activist, and he described in pretty gruesome detail some of the methods that are used to kill unborn babies. And this is a family show. I don't want to necessarily get into some of that, but I do encourage you, if you're an adult, I do encourage you to watch that clip, because he reads these truly gruesome, evil methods that are common. They are in common practice for abortion so-called doctors. I think calling people that kill unborn children doctors is kind of a bridge too far. I think that every one of them should be rotting in a jail cell for the rest of his life. But Congressman Gill is just reciting to this woman the things that she is advocating for. And he says, "Hey, which one of these do you like the best? What's your favorite way to kill babies? Do you like this method? Is that the one that you like to use?" And she refuses to answer him. And he says, "You don't want to answer that, do you? Because you know that it is indefensible and is ghastly and evil You know that. That's why it makes you uncomfortable. And I watched that and I thought, this is exactly how we win. By unashamed, bold lawmakers who want to lay the total truth in front of people, who want to take the mask off, take the euphemisms off. As far as I'm concerned, we shouldn't even be calling it abortion anymore. That is too safe of a term. It's too clinical of a term for what is, in fact, infanticide. And, as I said in my opening, genocide. We're committing genocide on the next generation, and we've been doing it for 50 years. So, how do we affect change that actually saves the lives of the unborn? Well, I don't think that it's primarily going to be with signs. I don't know that picketing is all that productive. Protesting, visibility is good, but most people's minds are not changed by having a sign thrust in their face and then being yelled at. The medical professionals who are committing the murders, I think step one is get them off the streets and in jail where they belong. But as far as women who have fallen prey to the confusion that leads them to commit this grave evil, I think we should have sympathy for them. And that's why I think ministries like Preborn are so important, because we need to get the truth out to people. We need mothers to see that their own child growing inside of them. We need to take away the power of Satan's lies that have enthralled millions of people. Many people are uncomfortable. Many Christians are uncomfortable with wielding the state. But again, as we've talked about on this show many times, God created government. And he didn't create it primarily to pave roads and provide schools. I think those are good things, and it's great if we're all agreeing that, in a democratic republic, we agree on how we want to spend our tax money, that we agree everybody should have roads and everybody should have schools, and it's great. I think that's fine. But that's not the primary function of government. The primary function of government is the punishment of evildoers. And so, Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Well, our children are not Caesar's. Our children are not Satan's. Our children belong to God. They're a blessing that he gives us for our good. You hear this argument about, I just can't afford having children. Let me tell you something. When my wife was pregnant, became pregnant with our son, this was in September of 2015. There were several months there where I was still in college, and then I graduated while she was pregnant. And we had initially intended, before getting pregnant, that, she was going to work for a while. We had an apartment. We didn't have this nice house with the big basement for my studio. Well, she was going to work for a while and support us, and I was going to pursue my writing. I don't talk about this a whole lot because it's not really an important part of my life at this point. But there for a stretch, I was a serious writer of science fiction and fantasy. I've written about 11 books, not really long, about 60,000 words each. Some of them pretty decent. I've had a couple nibbles from editors, but it never materialized. And she wasn't going to try to force me to change when we were going to have our son. But I had this moment where we were sitting in the office of WIC, the Women, Infants, and Children. It's a program by local health departments that provides funding for low-income families to feed their children, basically. And we were sitting in this office and at the health department. And the woman that was explaining the program to us was telling us all the things that we can get at the grocery store and the things that we're not allowed to get. The things that are eligible. And I remember sitting there. I grew up upper middle class. I grew up very well off. And my dad worked really hard. And he taught me about the value of hard work. And I'm sitting in the WIC office and I think, this is not how this is supposed to go. I'm a father now. I have a family to provide for. I can't afford to I can't let my wife be bearing my child and then going to work to support me in my sorry butt. And this woman telling me what I can and can't have for my family. And I said, no. That's my job. It's my job to provide for my family. Not your job, not the government's job, mine. And so I went out and I got the best job that I could find using a 4-year science degree. And it was paying about $34,000 a year. Heck, that was more money than I'd ever made in my life before working as a part-time soccer referee and at a gem mine. Even working full-time at the gem mine when I was in college that one summer, I was making like $300 a week. So, great. It was a starting point. And now, 10 years later, my son is actually turning 10. By the time you're watching this, he will be 10. His birthday's in a couple days. But 10 years later, I make more than twice that. And my family lives pretty comfortably. We have everything that we need. God has provided that. But he put me in that position where I had to realize I have a duty to this child. He's not born yet, and I already have a duty to him. And we need to make more people, we need to create circumstances for more people to have that revelation. Now, granted, it's not going to look the same for everyone. Not everyone is going to have the exact same road to Damascus moment. And I think it reaches men and women in different ways. I think that mothers need to be shown their child, because a mother has a natural instinct to care for and nurture her child. Even if society has programmed her to worship herself and nature and Satan, she has a built-in desire to care for her child and a built-in aptitude for it. And men have a built-in aptitude for work and for taking on physical suffering and taking on responsibility, bearing the weight of decisions. We could do a whole separate episode on suffrage and whether women should have the quote unquote right to vote, because, and this is really beyond the scope of the episode, but men are supposed to have more weight on them than women are. We're supposed to have more responsibility. And as a man, you should be filled with a desire to provide for your family, to raise, to love a woman that is your wife, to procreate with her, which is the only natural function of sex, is between a man and his wife. It doesn't have to lead to children every time. Due to decisions that I made hastily, God has seen fit to only bless us with one child. And that's okay. I'm going to raise him as faithfully and teach him as well as I can. But children are a blessing. I want to read one more Bible verse and then we're going to wrap up here because I know we're coming up on time. Well, we've already read in Psalm 139. I want to turn back to the Psalms, which getting to that from Isaiah is not terribly far. But I want to read Psalm 127, specifically verses 3 through 5. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Children are a heritage from the Lord. This is part of a larger problem with turning away from God and the resultant punishment. I do believe that the promises that God makes to Israel are promises that continue to the church if God's people will seek his face, repent from our sins and seek his face. Then he will turn back to us. And so when we quit worshiping ourselves and we quit putting everything on the altar of self, including our children, then we can start to heal some of the damage. I think this is a really, really fundamental issue. We need to teach people the importance of families. And I think a lot of things will fall in line if we do. If we teach men to be responsible, to love one woman, and to care for and raise a family. And we teach women to bear children, to nurture them, to respect their husbands. We teach people the importance of family. I think we can avoid a grave evil. And when we can't, that's what the state is for. So, thank you for watching another episode. I know this one has been heavy, but I thought it was very important to talk about. And so we'll wrap up here. But just remember, don't get caught up in the sensationalism. Don't get caught up in the politicking. It's a very simple issue. It really is. If life does not begin at conception, I defy you to name where it does and use science. Because you can't do it. Life begins when it begins. And that is when God breathes the breath of life into a child in his mother's womb. And God planned you before you were even in your mother's womb. That's what we learn from the Psalms. So God loves you. Don't forget that, and don't ever lose sight of the sanctity of life and the importance of family. Thanks again for watching. I'm Luke, not the saint, just a sinner, and this is Luke Up. Have a great day. God bless.